Martin Luther King Jr. was a national and world figure with strong local connections, especially to churches in Roxbury. This fall, those connections will draw attention to the legacy of leadership and ideas in King's writings. To tell us about the series of events is our guest from one of the sponsoring groups, the New Democracy Coalition. We'd like to welcome its founder and executive director, Kevin Peterson. Thank you very much for being with us, Kevin.
Always great to be here.
Kevin, I know you've engaged with the Words of King before because you had some other events, including at City Hall Plaza. But what about the series? What got this going?
Well, the series is about intentionally and intensely looking at some of King's words through the prism of his public theology, his way of engaging in the world, in the cities across the nation when he lived, but also across the nation and the world. King was not a person, as you might know, who stayed in the pulpit. He was pretty much about being in the streets and dealing with issues that impacted individuals. This series really focuses on the 4 public holidays that we engage in each year. The first was the International Day of Peace. Mariama Hammond spoke about that at the Howard Thurman Center some weeks ago. We have 3 more holidays. The next one that we're focusing on is Columbus Day, or as it's becoming to be known as Indigenous Indian Day, or First Peoples Nations Day. We're looking at King's engagement with the Indigenous Peoples Nation and how he sought to bring them into the Poor People's Campaign weeks before he died. And then we're looking at King's speech around Vietnam. So we're looking at peace and war and how Dr. King spoke about that. And we'll end on December 5th at the Grove Hall Public Library. All of these are at the Grove Hall Public Libraries on Thursdays at 5 p.m. And I'll get in more detail about that later. But we're ending with one of the nation's most preeminent scholars on Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Gary Dorian of Union Theological Institute. He's teaching at Boston University this fall.
What about your own engagement with these writings over the years? Was there anything that was really central for you?
Oh, the whole corpus of his work, Dr. King's work, is very important to me. I think that if I were pushed to embrace any one of these readings this fall, I think it would probably be Where Do We Go From Here? His book, Chaos or Community. It was his last book, and it is really an extended public meditation on King's thinking through his theology about where the nation should go. So after the tumult of Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, here King arrives fully fledged, so to speak, a full public theology talking about how we can think about being a better nation through his perspective of religion. It all boils down to, however, how we might think about civics and democracy. So in some ways we can pull away the theological patina that King placed on his public engagement and think about democracy in deeper ways and think about civic engagement in Boston and across the nation.
Of course, it's also something that makes me think of how different a time we live in, because engagement before was, even orderly and nonviolent engagement was out in the streets, big meetings.
Yeah.
Now it seems to have just sort of dwindled into social media.
So, social media. Well, we live in a different era. Even during what we see as the civil rights movement, that was a different era where television broadcast the civil rights movement to a significant degree. We witnessed turns in the civil rights movement when we witnessed on TV the attacks of protesters in Selma, Alabama, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So, fast forward 50 years or 3 generations later, the rights for others remains important, and there are points at which we still need to engage, but it's a different level. So we're using this forum, this quaint forum over at the Grove Hall Public Library. Again, our next meeting is on October 10th, 5:30. At the Grove Hall Library, 41 Geneva Avenue. We're using forums like this to engage community members, but also religious thinkers and community activists, and thinking about how we think about justice and democracy and a moral civic reality for us all.
One of the works that you're going to be at least excerpting from is Why We Can't Wait.
Yeah.
Why was that chosen?
Well, it was chosen because it was really it is the apex of King's thinking in terms of how he viewed civic engagement, but also how he viewed democracy more broadly, and it spoke about the urgency. There are deep references to the Montgomery struggle, for example, and how that struggle was perceived by the nation as a struggle that was that could be put on hold, or could be negotiated through the legal system. King's option was to state before the nation that we can't wait for the winds of inevitability to roll, that we must take action, we must engage actively and with a sense of moral agency and moral urgency to address some of the problems in the nation.
When I look for a comparison to Martin Luther King's campaigns in the 60s, I guess the closest thing I can come to is the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's a sort of a more nebulous kind of thing.
That's right.
But what do you think about that comparison?
Well, I think it's a fair comparison. I mean, all iterations, as I know them, in terms of the struggle for black freedom in the annals of U.S. history, have taken a character unto itself. There was the abolitionist movement, of course, and we have various civil rights movements. One that is not mentioned during the 40s, where there's great legal engagement by the NAACP around lynching and desegregation. That's the quiet civil rights movement. We had a louder civil rights movement in terms of Dr. King's and Malcolm X's engagement. We are now in the 2000s, in this millennial age, engaging in a different type of movement that is a little more nebulous, as you say, but all the more important. The struggle and the issue before us now, this generation, is how do we use the technologies, how do you use our capacity to be in contact with each other on the face-to-face and very tactile ways to communicate the importance of justice. We in the city of Boston continue to struggle around Faneuil Hall and the iconic reflection of systemic racism that it represents. 105 businesses and shops at Faneuil Hall, a place named after a slaveholder, a place very close to where slaves were sold. 105 businesses and shops. There are no African American businesses that are owned there. That's a tragedy. In a public space, Faneuil Hall is publicly owned. In a public space, we don't find economic justice in a building. So this is not disconnected with Dr. King's public theology and his public efforts to ensure equity.
Of course, right now, lots of people here talking about displacement in the housing market,
yes.
Racial disparities in education. So how does King relate to that?
Well, it's for King, the baseline is justice. You know, how do you ensure justice? If you're a Cape Verdean, African American, Latino male in the city of Boston between 18 and 34, you're more likely to be a victim of murder. You're less likely to find justice in the courts. If you're a young 14-year-old female child of Caribbean descent living in Mattapan, you're more likely to live in poverty than your white counterpart, and you're more likely to go to a school which the state would consider underperforming. So we still grapple with these issues of vast social division that is undergirded by a racial animus that we need to address. It's no different now in terms of the issue or the question of justice now in 2019 than it was in Dr. King's day.
We should mention in these events that I'm sure there will be some reading, but will there be some sort of back and forth as well with the audience?
Yes, these readings, these events are almost, in some sense, they're a round table, but we'll have more than a few people there that will fill up the round table. But we organizing these events to be very interactive. Where there will be a reading that sort of sets the baseline for the discussion. And on this coming Thursday night, Jean-Luc Perit of the North American Indian Center of Boston will talk about the engagement of First Peoples communities, not only in the history of this nation, but also in the civil rights movement. And there will be opportunity for ample engagement and back and forth with community leaders, activists, and laypersons. So all are invited.
One other thing I want to ask you about is King's connection to congregations in Boston. We just heard about that with the celebration of the 80th anniversary at Mount Pleasant Missionary Baptist Church, and of course also at the services for the late Reverend Michael Haynes. What about those connections that King cultivated here, and how important he was to people in Boston?
Well, I think we have to realize that King, or embrace the fact that King was a native son to a certain degree. He arrived here in Boston in his early 20s. He met his wife here. He met the great Howard Thurman here. Some of your audience may know, but a looming figure in our nation's life. Howard Thurman was considered by Time magazine as one of the most impactful preachers across the United States. So King engaged in significant ways in Boston and came to his intellectual maturity, some would say, here in Boston. He of course lived on Mass Ave, but he also lived in Roxbury, preached at the 12th Baptist Church, and garnered a whole group of friends to which he remained connected until the day that he died. We will see the King Memorial in Boston Commons pretty soon. We need to continue to pull or celebrate the connections that King had in Boston as much as he had in Atlanta, as much as he had in Selma and Montgomery.
We should mention if people want some more details about the series and what's coming up next, is there where they can get that?
Well, they can go to the Facebook of the New Democracy Coalition. They'll see a flyer, but they can also call the Boston Public Library, the Grove Hall branch, 41 Geneva Avenue, and they'll have information in terms of that meeting and the succeeding meetings throughout the fall.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kevin Peterson from the New Democracy Coalition.